FanDuel has released the 2024 college football win total projections, and let's just say I'm going to be taking the over for the Louisville Cardinals. I'm going to explain why you should too on today's episode of the show. That said, stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Happy Tuesday. Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers join today, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. As always, I want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. Last week, FanDuel released the college football win total projections for the Atlantic Coast Conference, including, obviously, the Louisville Cardinals. They have Jeff Brom's program slated at over under 8.5 wins. So, for me, it's easy. I'm going to take the over on that, and I'm going to explain why you should too. But we also need to acknowledge that the schedule is tougher than what people think. We'll explain why on the second segment of the show. And then at the conclusion, we will talk about the Cardinals standing out for a highly regarded 2025 tight end prospect, Caden Piening. So a lot of football talk on today's episode of the show. Last week, the title sponsor of this episode, big friends of the show, FanDuel, released their 2024 college football win total projections. Louisville was amongst the highest in the ACC. They weren't at the highest. Florida State was at 9.5. I think some other programs were at 9.5 as well. Clemson was at 9.5, although both Florida State and Clemson had plus odds to get to 9.5. So Vegas believes that it's more likely that they don't get to that mark. But for the Cardinals at over under 8.5 wins, FanDuel has Louisville minus 114 to get essentially 9 wins. And under 8.5 is minus 106. So it's not a big shift, but probability speaking, the Vegas believes that Louisville is more likely to get to 9 wins than to not get to 9 wins. Now, I'm not a huge betting man. I am not going to sit here and act like I am a betting expert, but this feels like a number that I'm comfortable putting a decent amount of money on, because 8.5, you're essentially saying that Louisville can only lose 3 regular season games. Obviously, this is pertaining to the regular season. Make that point known. But ultimately, I feel pretty good about this, and for a couple reasons. Number one, I feel you can look at it as upgrades, continuity, and schedule. Upgrades, on paper, this is one of the more talented teams in the past decade or so. Now, that's the key thing, is on paper, they still have to put things together. They have to stay healthy. They have to come together and be cohesive on the field. But for the most part, I feel more comfortable about next year's team winning 10 games than I did this past year's team, despite the schedules being a little bit different. So the team got better on both sides of the football. You go position by position. Quarterback, ceiling-wise, you got better. Running back is probably a wash. Offensive line, probably a wash, although there might be some upgrades on the line. Wide receiving core, I feel like, was an upgrade. Tight end room was an upgrade. So there wasn't a position that took a step back on the offensive side, and there were a couple that upgraded, at least on paper. It's all about projection. You go to the defensive side. Linebacking core is pretty much the same. And with that being the case, I feel like that's an upgrade because you held on to some key players. You bring in a guy like Geronte Davis, TJ Capers, Stanquan Clark, both a year older, TJ Quinn, Jalen Alderman. Defensive line, upgrade. You return Jermaine Lole, Des Tell. You bring in FCS All-American Thor Griffith, who was on Bruce Feldman's annual freaks list, 6'2", 320 pounds. Jordan Girard from Florida International. I feel like the Cardinals' defensive line on the interior is going to be solid. You look at the pass rush. Ashton Gelati is back. Mason Riger's back. You go to Tennessee, you get Tyler Barron. Your edge position is better than it was. So defensive line's an upgrade. Linebacking core is an upgrade due to continuity. The secondary. Safety's an upgrade. You brought in Wesley Walker, MJ Griffin's back, Blake Ruffin's in, etc. Cornerback, you bring Quincy Riley back, Tay Holloway, Corey Thornton, Tamarian McDonald, Taz Nicholson. You brought some key players in via the portal, some veteran Power 5 guys. Aaron Williams is healthy. I look at the defense overall. Every single position the team upgraded. Offensively, needless to say, no position downgraded. So on paper, this team is going to be better than they were a year ago, theoretically. That's why, and I think that that's going to come to fruition because you also look at the continuity aspect of things. That's the number 2 thing we're focusing on. You can't discount what another year of familiarity and continuity of a coaching system can do for a program. Yes, this is a team that brought in 27 to 28 transfers, 14 to 15 freshmen. So you're replacing half the team, or you're bringing in half of a new team. But for the returning guys, and Louisville didn't lose a ton of returning players. The players that were returning are more often than not guys that played a ton of snaps. So you have players that played a ton of snaps that are returning, that are, not necessarily learning the system anymore. They know the system. They're growing within the system. And I think that that's going to help this program more than people think because it's not being talked about a lot. We talk about the roster upgrade. We talk about the schedule, and those have been the main 2 focus points of the of the offseason is that you have a better team, but you have a tougher schedule. What's also not being talked about enough is the continuity with this coaching staff. With the system being in place, you're building the culture, you're building the level of play within your system, and ultimately, I think that bodes well for this team moving forward. Now, it all sort of comes together, and that alone, you have continuity in the system, you have a better team on paper with more depth, and getting to 10 wins feels like it's possible. I mean, last year's team got to 10 wins. However, the schedule's different. But here's the thing about it is there's some give and take here. It's not one of the best schedules in the country, but let's be 100% clear. It's not a cupcake schedule either, like people want to throw out there. Number one, just because the Cardinals are in the ACC, but also because, you look at the schedule and it doesn't bring a ton of optimism in terms of tough teams. But you have games where I feel like you can get to 9 wins. You look at the toughest competition, Notre Dame, Miami, Clemson, and Kentucky. Those 4 games, you are essentially stating that Louisville will not lose to all 4 of them. And if they end up splitting those 2, that they can still drop a game that maybe they shouldn't and still get to 9 wins. There's a couple of different formulas, a couple of different situations and scenarios as to how Louisville can trigger this 8.5 win threshold. For me, it's like 9 to 10 wins is where I'm kind of fluctuating back and forth. Now, more you win, the less margin of error there is. So there's not much separating 8 to 10 wins. You're talking 2 games in which you don't execute at the end of games. And unfortunately, how different would this year have been had Louisville not been able to hold on against Georgia Tech or Indiana or Virginia or Miami? You had a couple 50-50 games that just didn't necessarily it did necessarily work in your favor. What happens if 1 to 2 of those games don't? Then you're looking at the season a lot different. But I think the team being better, that's the number one thing for me is this team is upgraded. They're starting 22, but they've also increased depth, which was such an issue last year. Louisville really struggled down the stretch when key players got hurt, and Louisville really had issues filling that level of production. Continuity. you were playing on a whole new scheme last year. Year one of a coaching staff. You cannot discount what Jeff Brom is able to do, getting more and more of his players into this system. That's another thing. And I think the schedule, albeit it's challenging, it still has opportunity for Louisville to get to 9 wins. And I'm confident that they'll do so. But it's not going to be easy. I think that this is more of a testament to my faith in Brom and this team rather than a reflection of how I feel about this schedule. Because let's be honest, the schedule is tougher than people think. We're going to explain why here momentarily after we talk about our friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel is not only good for the football side of things. The NBA All-Star break is over. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with the quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel is the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Hey, Cardinal fans, thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that the show is free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day, including on YouTube and now Amazon Fire TV. Also, a reminder, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channel. The season is like, what? A little over 6 months away, but I'm already excited for football. And this schedule, it's really hard to sort of decipher because there are some challenging games hidden throughout. There's some blatant tough games on the schedule looking you right in the face. And then there are flat out games that Louisville should win, and they should win by a good amount. For the first time in X amount of years, probably since 2020 when they played Western Kentucky, and then before that it was Charlotte in 2016. First time Louisville's opened up the season with a non-Power 5 or non-conference opponent. They play against Austin Peay, and then they'll play Jacksonville State. So, the schedule, people will automatically look at Louisville's schedule and say, ACC doesn't count. Why do you even play the games? Too easy. And I understand the perception with the Atlantic Coast Conference. Like, I get it. No matter what I say, there will be people that listen to this and people that don't listen to this that say, I don't care what you say. ACC's weak. They beat up on each other, but when they play better teams, it doesn't matter. I get it. I don't agree with that sentiment, but, there are some solid teams that Louisville does play. To get to 9 wins, you have to really be on the ball for the majority of the season with very few errors throughout the year. Now, there are a couple games that Louisville should definitely win. I think Austin Peay, Jacksonville State could be a slip-up game, the second game of the year, but I think Louisville should win that game. Austin Peay, Jacksonville State, Virginia, even though it's on the road where the Cardinals have struggled, Boston College the same way, and then also Stanford. I think right there, that's 5 wins that you should have, right? 5 of the 7, you're going to be favored in, and for all intents and purposes, you should win those games, especially the first 2. I understand that Virginia and Boston College could be slip-up games, trap games because of their placement. Virginia's after the SMU game before Miami. Boston College is after Miami and before Clemson. So their placement's a little bit interesting, but you should win those games. And I'm not going to sit here and pitch those games as tough opponents because, Louisville should win all those games potentially by double digits. So you're looking at 5 of the 12 games, almost 50% of the schedule, Louisville should win. Outside of that, you have a couple of games where Louisville probably is favored, but who knows? I think Georgia Tech is sort of one of those games to where we're overlooking. There's always a team that we overlook in the offseason. A couple years ago, it was Syracuse in 2022. 2024, I feel like it's going to be Georgia Tech. The Yellow Jackets under Brent Key were a lot more competitive than what people gave them credit for. They took Louisville down to the wire. They beat North Carolina. They were somewhat competitive against Georgia for the first part of the game. Actually, they were competitive against Georgia for the majority of that game, if my memory is serving me correct. Even though they're coming to play at L&N Cardinal Stadium, it's going to be a challenging game. So I still think Louisville should win that game, but you look at the games on the schedule that are challenging: Notre Dame, Miami, Clemson, Kentucky, SMU. There is a chance that now the stars will have to align here, but in a perfect world, that's not all that unrealistic. Maybe with Kentucky. I don't think Kentucky will be ranked when the Cardinals play them at the end of the year, but all 5 teams could be ranked. Georgia Tech could be ranked, even though that's in the 4th week of the season. But Notre Dame's probably going to be ranked. SMU could definitely be ranked coming off the season that they had last year, winning the American Athletic Conference, first year in the ACC. Miami was probably the biggest winner in the ACC in the portal, getting Cam Ward. And if the talent's able to play together, the Hurricanes are going to be really, really tough to deal with. Clemson, they're going to have a bounce back season. They were young last year. They used the portal a little bit more this season. They brought some guys back. Clemson's going to be tough. So you've got some very, very challenging games. And the majority of these 5 games, Kentucky, Clemson, Notre Dame, they're on the road. Notre Dame, even though Louisville had won there back in 2014, not an easy place to play in South Bend. The Cardinals have never beaten Clemson in their time in the ACC, let alone on the road down in Death Valley Junior. And then you have on the road at Kentucky. So I think 2 things can be true at one time. For starters, this isn't the best schedule in the country. It's not. I mean, I think Notre Dame's probably going to be your highest ranked team, although Miami could be right there. I think that Miami is probably going to be ranked. Notre Dame's going to be ranked. SMU will possibly be ranked as well. Clemson will be ranked. So you're starting out the season with 4 teams being ranked right off the bat that could very well be ranked when you play them. I'm not looking at Georgia Tech's schedule. They would have to be Florida State. But if they were to upset Florida State, who knows? I think they definitely would be ranked, but this Georgia Tech team's going to be tough. And this isn't me just blowing smoke about the ACC, because although this schedule isn't the best in the country, I would caution you to think that this is a cupcake schedule. Now, there's going to be a lot of the national media that will say, well, Louisville's not really played anybody. Do not listen to those people. They are wrong. And that's what it comes down to. They are flat out wrong. Because I understand it might not be an SEC schedule. You're kind of at the mercy of your conference. Maybe not the Big Ten either. But out of the ACC, yes, they do. They don't have to play Florida State. They don't have to play North Carolina. But they still have Notre Dame as one of their out-of-conference games. They have Kentucky as one of their out-of-conference games. Louisville, on a year-in, year-out basis, usually is one of the Power 5 teams that schedules the toughest out-of-conference opponents. Now, I guess it evens out when you have SEC teams that play cupcakes out of conference and then play the schedule that they do in conference. But out of conference, you can't say that Louisville ducks from any smoke, because they've shown that they're not scared to play Alabama. They're not scared to play Auburn. They're not scared to play Mississippi. They'll play Notre Dame every couple of years. Kentucky is obviously a rival. So, yes, Austin Peay and Jacksonville State aren't the greatest, but this is one of the first years that they've had, I feel like, 2 non-Power 5 teams that also aren't in like the American Conference or something like that they're playing. So this schedule is more challenging, and it's tougher than what people think, because Miami at home is going to be a challenging game. At Notre Dame is going to be a challenging game. At Clemson is going to be challenging. SMU is going to be tough at home. At Kentucky, it depends on how they fare in the season, but it still will be tough. You're looking at 5 of the 12 games. Almost 50% of the games can be a objectively viewed as challenging games. If you're telling me that Louisville is facing a challenge in half of the schedule, and outside of that, you have a team like Georgia Tech that could be a tough team to play. I mean, for me, we have to get out of these trends of being, open to groupthink, because people want to ride trends and they want to give the popular opinion. And we have to look at this analytically. And I understand it's February, but when you're talking about win totals, people say, well, Louisville could win 11 games. Yeah, they could. Got to look at it as the schedule. The schedule is going to be more challenging, but we will see how this turns out for the team. So I'm sure that there will continue to be roster movement across the country. But spring ball will start here soon. That means 2025 recruiting will continue to heat up. The Cardinals have received 2 commitments over the past month, 2 offensive linemen, one of them from the state of Ohio. Jeff Brom and company looking to somewhat create a pipeline back into Southern Ohio, and they're looking to do so now with a highly regarded 2025 tight end prospect who has stated that the Cardinals are standing out in his recruitment. We'll talk about Caden Piening's recruitment here momentarily after we talk about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else, and LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, final segment of the show, going back to the recruiting side of things. Look, Cardinal fans, 2025 recruiting is going to start heating up here soon. We're going to start seeing more unofficial visits as spring ball starts, because that's when things really start to take off. Your post-national signing day, you're sort of in that lull between like the true end of the offseason and the beginning of next year. Spring practice is going to start just around the corner. We have seen Louisville unofficially visit a couple of players on the road down in South Florida, but there's a player up in Ohio that I want to talk about. And honestly, the Ohio area is a geographical location that I would like Louisville to try to create some type of a pipeline into, because that's a place that Kentucky has really kind of dominated outside of the internal Ohio schools, where Ohio State, and then you even also have Penn State to the northeast, and Michigan, others. Ohio is a hotbed for recruiting. There's a ton of talent in that area, especially Cincinnati, and then you have Cleveland as well. But Cincinnati is a big-time talent area. One player from the Cincinnati area that Louisville has gotten involved with offered back in June. He was on campus for the Notre Dame game, so he witnessed that game, which was wild. Caden Piening, and I hope I'm saying that last name right, Piening, listed as an athlete, 6'4", 230 pounds, plays for Anderson High School. Ranked as the 603rd best player according to the 24/7 Sports Composite, 54th best athlete, 21st best player in the state of Ohio. He's being recruited as a tight end. This past season, he had, I believe it was 35 catches, 624 yards, and 14 touchdowns. Very solid pass catcher. Also think underrated blocker as well, but does a couple of different things for Anderson, but projects to be a tight end. He just recently released his top 10. Louisville was in that with Florida, Central Florida, Michigan State, Arkansas, Illinois, Stanford, Virginia, Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech. So a ton of Power 5 flavor, and going to be a very highly regarded tight end prospect. Now, I don't really put too much stock into top 10s outside of really top 5s, truthfully. Maybe top 6 you can swing as critical, but top 10, there's a lot of possibilities there. But one thing that I found interesting in an article from Mick Walker, who I believe is a 24/7 sports analyst for, I think, Purdue, if I'm not mistaken, listed the Cardinals not only Louisville, but Florida and Michigan State were the teams out in front and standing out in his recruitment. So not only is Louisville in the top 10, but it's a little bit more significant because they're standing out. And it would not surprise me to see, Piening as a player that's on campus unofficially for the spring, maybe multiple times. Spring game would be a perfect time for him to be back on campus. Obviously, he has the familiarity with the program. This is a guy that Braum offered back in 2023. So I think the MO, not only for Braum, but for this Louisville football program, is they like to get out in front of recruitments. They like to offer early on and build that relationship. So if their projections are right and these players exceed, their current ranking and they get a rankings boost, well, when other teams come to try to build a relationship, Louisville's already right there in the mix. I think that this is a good spot to be in. Michigan State and Florida are going to be two challenging programs to go up against. They have recruited pretty well, and if you want to get some solid players, you have to compete with some of the best programs, and this is going to be no different of a situation. But this season, I feel like, is going to be a key for tight end recruiting because you've got the personnel now. You brought in Mark Redmond from San Diego State, Isaiah Cummings from Kentucky, Jaleel Skinner from Miami. You have Jamari Johnson back. You have Nate Kariski back. 4-star tight end from Michigan, Dylan Mesman, is in. I think that the way that you utilize tight ends in this offense, now Braum has a track record of, getting tight ends involved. He prioritizes blocking at the position, but also has a ton of creative and crafty ways to get his tight ends the football, and they are a staple of the receiving offense. And if last year sort of is what it was due to depth, but there were times where tight end was featured. But if you this year sort of change the way the tight end position is utilized, where you have more depth, you have more versatility, you have more overall talent, to where the guys are getting the ball out in space. You're creating different situations to make it more attractive for tight ends to come play at Louisville. Makes a ton of sense. So the commitment timeline is the main thing here. If he just released the top 10 just a couple days ago, that would probably bode well for the timeline. Maybe the summer, maybe he makes another list cut before his senior season. If he makes another list cut before his senior year, I feel like that probably bodes better for Louisville because the way that Jeff Braum and company are going to utilize the tight end spot is going to be attractive to other tight ends. Now, getting a player from the city of Cincinnati in that Southern Ohio corridor after they went into the state of Ohio and got a commitment from 2025 offensive lineman. His name's escaping me at the moment. Jake Cook from Westerville, Ohio, which, if I'm not mistaken, isn't too far from the city of Cincinnati. It's actually right outside of Columbus, which is a great area as well in terms of talent. So it's probably a little bit further away than I thought. I'm still learning my Ohio geography. So Ohioans, please don't be mad at me. But Caden Piening is definitely an offensive recruit to watch moving forward for the Louisville Cardinals at a position that this time next year could be a position of need. So one to focus on. But that's going to wrap up today's episode of the show. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.